In 1999, the producers of an HBO film about Dorothy Dandridge went looking for her daughter. Lynn had been living in a California state institution since 1963. That was 36 years. Dorothy had been dead for 34 of them. The producers wanted to know if Lynn was still alive. They wanted to know where she was. They wanted to know if anyone had visited her. What they found stopped them. The institution in which Lynn had been held, according to the person who went looking, had burned down. The records, whatever they contained, were gone. And Lynn herself had been transferred somewhere. Nobody connected to the production could find out where. The state institution she was in burned down several years ago. Nobody knows where Lynn went afterward. That sentence. Read it again. Nobody knows where Lynn went. This is not a story about a woman who fell through the cracks. Cracks imply an accident. What happened to Lynn Dandridge was not an accident. It was the accumulated result of specific decisions made by specific people, and the equally specific decision of nearly everyone else to look away. Here is what I can tell you. There were at minimum 14 people positioned around Lynn Dandridge's life. A mother who loved her completely and died broke at 42. A father who was at a golf course the day she was born and left no account of her for the rest of his life. Multiple private caretakers hired across 2 decades. Childhood physicians. State institution staff. A television host who gave Dorothy the one public moment she ever had. A second husband who helped dismantle the financial structure keeping Lynn in private care. And researchers who came later, decades later, carrying flashlights into the dark. Each of those 14 witnesses saw something the others could not. Each had a function. Each saw something real. Not one of them was ever formally asked what they saw. The list was never compiled. We compiled it. They were all there. Nobody asked them. Old Money Women's compiles the list. Subscribe so no witness goes unheard again. The name in the hospital record was Harolyn Suzanne Nicholas. The name the people who loved her used was Lynn. Those are the same person, and they are not quite the same person, because what each category of witness saw was genuinely different, and the woman those accounts assemble together is more complete than any single one of them contains. Lynn Dandridge grew up in a series of rented and owned homes in Los Angeles, and the person present for the greatest number of her daily hours was not her mother. It was whoever Dorothy had most recently hired to manage Lynn while Dorothy worked. This was not indifference. It was arithmetic. The cost of Lynn's private care was relentless and escalating. Dorothy's income, nightclub engagements, film roles, concert tours across the country, was the single mechanism keeping the arrangement functional. She performed to pay for Lynn's care. The performing required her to be away from Lynn. The absence required paid caretakers. The geometry of that situation was airless. There was no exit from it except either more money or less care. The caretakers saw what that system looked like from inside. They were the people present during the hours no documentary would film. The ordinary Tuesday mornings, the difficult afternoons, the nights when Lynn's world contracted to whatever room she was in and whoever was in it with her. What they saw was a young woman who was severely cognitively disabled and who had nonetheless built, within those limitations, a specific and consistent interior world. Dorothy documented one piece of it precisely in her autobiography. Lynn had a relationship with the piano in the house, a Mason and Hamlin, that was entirely her own. She would sit at it and play the scale. Only the scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Over and over, without variation, for hours. And then, at intervals that seemed to come from some internal rhythm. She would turn on the bench and look at whoever was in the room. Waiting. She was waiting to be applauded. The caretakers were the ones in the room for that moment day after day, in the years when Dorothy was on the road. They were the witnesses to the consistency of it, not as a charming anecdote from a memoir, but as the daily reality of a person who wanted acknowledgement and had found exactly one reliable way to ask for it. Dorothy also wrote, without elaboration, that she encountered problems with some caretakers. She chose the word problems. She did not specify. What that unspecified word reveals is this. Lynn's experience of care was dependent on the character and attention of whoever was being paid to provide it, and that character varied. Dorothy could detect the difference in Lynn, which means the caretaker's relationship to Lynn showed up in the child. The quality of care was legible in who Lynn was on a given day. The caretakers saw the woman who existed in the daily hours nobody else was watching. Dorothy Dandridge saw something no other witness had access to and no other witness could have produced. The private love that existed between them, entirely outside what Lynn could articulate or understand. She wrote in everything and nothing that Lynn would press against her, hard, crushing, and that the physical weight of that contact was unlike anything else she had known. She wrote plainly, without reaching for sentiment. Lynn did not know she was her mother. Lynn knew only that this particular person was warm, that she was safe, that she was someone who liked her and who she liked back. Dorothy also wrote something that has been partially quoted in nearly every account of this story, and has rarely been given its full weight. She wrote that she knew. She was clear-eyed about this, that to everyone else Lynn was hideous. She wrote it not to condemn the world's reaction but to name the specific private space she occupied inside it. The space where none of that was true. The space that was only hers. That gap between what the world saw when it looked at Lynn and what Dorothy saw is the interior of Dorothy Dandridge's experience of motherhood. No other witness occupied it. It died with Dorothy on September 8, 1965. It was never replicated. The medical record of Lynn's life begins at her birth and tells a story in clinical language that is precise about what it includes and equally precise about what it omits. The delivery was difficult from the beginning. Harold Nicholas had taken the family's car to a golf course while Dorothy was in labor. Dorothy waited at his sister-in-law's home until the pain became impossible to manage, then left without him. By the time she reached the hospital, she was already delayed. Forceps were used during delivery. Dorothy would spend the rest of her life believing the delay and the instruments had damaged her daughter's brain. The physicians who examined Lynn confirmed it. Cerebral anoxia, brain damage from oxygen deprivation at birth, severe cognitive disability, permanent ceiling. She would have, the doctor told Dorothy, the mental capacity of a 4-year-old for the rest of her life. The same doctor who delivered that verdict also delivered a recommendation. Give Lynn up. Have another child. Move on. Dorothy refused. What the medical record contains is the clinical architecture of Lynn's life. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the functional ceiling. What it does not contain is the interior of the life built beneath that ceiling. The medical record is the container. The domestic testimony is what was built inside it. Both together are the complete picture. Neither alone is sufficient. The physicians who later staffed the state institutions where Lynn would spend 4 decades operated under a different framework entirely. Institutional medicine in mid-20th century California did not treat its long-term residents primarily as people with advocates. It managed them. The distinction between those two approaches, treating versus managing, is the distance between a human being and a case file. What the institutional physicians saw of Lynn, and what they chose to record or not record, is a question the public record cannot answer. If the fire account is accurate, the records from whatever institution she was in for most of those 40 years no longer exist. That gap in the medical record is itself a form of testimony. For more than 15 years after Lynn's birth, Dorothy Dandridge did not speak publicly about her. The people who attended her performances, read her interviews, watched her films, they knew in some peripheral way that she had a daughter with a disability. They did not know the shape of it. They did not know what the daily reality looked like or what it had cost. The performance Dorothy gave in public was not a lie, but it was a performance. And the woman behind it was managing something that would have broken most people, quietly, without acknowledgement, while the spotlight stayed on the glamour. In 1963, she finally spoke. She appeared on the Mike Douglas Show, broadcast out of Cleveland. She sat in front of a studio audience that had come to see a movie star, and she said, "My daughter had a brain injury at birth." The audience was stunned into silence. She continued. She said she had never really believed she could give Lynn up to an institution. She said the longest she had been away from her was about 6 months. She said Lynn had no conception of time, did not know how long Dorothy had been gone, did not even know that Dorothy was her mother. And then, "She only knows that I'm a nice person." The segment was broadcast nationally. People watched. Some wept. And then the program ended and the next one began. The public saw one woman in 1963 that they had never seen before. She was the same woman the caretakers and the doctors had always known existed. The public was simply the last to find out. And then they found out, and then they moved on, and Lynn went back to wherever she was. Harold Nicholas was one half of the Nicholas brothers, a tap dancing partnership so celebrated that Fred Astaire called them the greatest dancers he had ever seen. In the household, what he was is simpler to describe: primarily absent, and absent in ways that had structural consequences for every other person in the house. The day Lynn was born, Harold was at a golf course. He had taken the family car. Dorothy was in labor at home. She was dropped at his sister-in-law's and waited there until the pains became impossible. They left without him in a neighbor's car. By the time Dorothy arrived at the hospital, the damage was already accumulating. That is the account of the first hours of Lynn's life. Harold Nicholas is not in it. What the household subsequently saw was a man who treated financial provision, when the money was coming before it stopped, as the complete definition of fatherhood. Dorothy wrote that after Lynn's diagnosis, Harold toured extensively in Europe, living, in her words, the life of a bachelor. She sent letters. She begged him to come home, to accept Lynn as she was, to be present. He did not reply. The money stopped arriving. When Dorothy finally reached him directly, he told her he enjoyed his life in Paris and that the marriage was finished. The household knew. They were the ones present in the house while the letters went unanswered. Lynn had, functionally, the cognitive and emotional world of a 4-year-old. What she could perceive of her father was limited to direct experience. Presence or absence, warmth or its opposite. The record offers no documented account of Harold Nicholas maintaining a sustained relationship with Lynn after the marriage dissolved. He moved through his subsequent life, more relationships, another child born in 1958, continued performance work, a career legacy that endures, while Lynn moved from private care to state institution to wherever she was transferred when the records burned. What Lynn perceived of her father is a question the assembled testimony cannot answer. Because no one asked. Because Lynn could not say. Harold Nicholas had no recorded involvement in Lynn's medical care at any stage of her life. The physicians who examined Lynn, who delivered diagnoses, who made clinical recommendations, they dealt with Dorothy. Dorothy was in the room. Dorothy received the information. Dorothy made the decisions. The co-parent who had been present at the conception was not present at any documented medical appointment. What the doctors saw of Harold Nicholas was a blank space in the room where a second parent would have stood. That blank space was part of the clinical picture of Lynn's life. It simply was not named as such. The public saw a star. Harold Nicholas was charming, physically extraordinary, and celebrated with complete justification for his art. The Nicholas brothers' work is part of the permanent record of American performance. The man the household saw, the one who was absent before his daughter drew her first breath, who stopped answering his wife's letters, who removed himself from the financial and practical structure that might have kept Lynn in private care, was not the man the public saw on stage. The gap between those two men is the portrait. He never agreed to sit for it. It exists in the assembled testimony anyway. Every witness saw a different man. The man the household knew and the man the audience celebrated were not recognizably the same person. The width of that gap is what the assembled list reveals. No other witness had access to Lynn's continuous, unobserved daily existence. The caretaker who lived in the house, who managed the full range of Lynn's behavior across ordinary days, saw what no appointment or visit could reveal. The pattern beneath the pattern. Dorothy documented that Lynn could be violent. The accounts from 1963, when Lynn was returned to Dorothy after the private care payments stopped, describe a 19-year-old who was sometimes physically dangerous. The caretaker who preceded that crisis, whoever held that position in the years before institutionalization, was the person who had managed that violence daily for years before it reached the point of crisis. She knew what preceded it. She knew what stopped it. She knew Lynn's specific triggers, her specific sequences from stability to danger and back again. That operational knowledge, practical, physical, irreplaceable, existed in one person's body and experience at a time. It did not transfer by report. When Lynn moved into the state institution, Nobody interviewed the outgoing caretaker. Nobody asked what the institution needed to know about this specific person. Lynn arrived as a case file. The knowledge arrived as a private memory in someone else's life. When it was not transferred, it was lost. And that loss was not recorded anywhere, because the system had no mechanism to register what it was losing. Dorothy was the only person for whom Lynn reached. Not because Lynn knew her as her mother, but because Lynn had accumulated, through repeated experience, a specific recognition of warmth. Preference. Dorothy wrote about this with unusual precision. She was not describing love in the sentimental sense. She was describing a behavior. Lynn, in a room with multiple people, moved toward Dorothy. Not because Lynn understood the relationship, because she had learned, through accumulated contact, that this particular person was safe. That behavior existed only when Dorothy was present. The caretakers could not observe it. The doctors could not observe it. The studio audience could not observe it. After September 8, 1965, nobody observed it again, because the person who produced it was gone. The staff who worked in whatever facilities Lynn moved through over 40 years occupied the position the private caretakers had once held, with one crucial difference. The private caretakers were hired specifically for Lynn, and their continued employment depended at least partially on their ability to manage her well. The institutional staff managed many patients, under conditions that California's own later records would characterize as systematically inadequate. What the institutional staff saw was a woman aging inside a system not designed to know her. They saw whether she was comforted or frightened in her daily routines, whether she still reached toward people, whether, if there was a piano in a common room, she sat at it, whether she still turned on the bench. None of that is in any public record. The fire, if the account is accurate, destroyed whatever documentation existed from the primary institution. What the staff saw of Lynn's 40 years' lives, if it lives anywhere in private memory. Mike Douglas, on his Cleveland program in 1963, was the only person positioned to observe a specific and unrepeatable threshold. The moment Dorothy Dandridge chose, in public, to stop being alone with this. He saw her before she spoke. He created the space in which she spoke. He was in the room when a studio audience encountered, for the first time, the gap between the woman they knew and the woman who had been carrying this for 20 years. The segment was broadcast nationally. It raised awareness. It was praised. And then it ended. And nobody followed up with a question that the moment seemed to demand. Where is Lynn now, and is anyone going to her? The moment existed. And then the moment ended. Nobody asked. That was not an accident. Dorothy's account of the day the moving men came is one of the most precise passages in Everything and Nothing. The furniture was being carried out of the Hollywood home she was losing, the $65,000 showplace from which she was now being legally evicted. The men were doing their job. And Lynn was at the piano, playing the scale. Only the scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And at some internal interval, she turned on the bench and looked at the moving men, waiting. They understood immediately. They applauded. Dorothy wrote this moment with love. She wrote it because strangers, there to empty her house, had taken roughly 15 minutes to understand something essential about her daughter and had responded correctly. She found grace in that. Now place that account beside the caretaker account. The years of daily life with that piano. The years of that specific gesture, the turn, the wait, repeated not once in a dramatic scene but hundreds of times in ordinary rooms with whoever happened to be present. Together, those two accounts say something neither says alone. Lynn was consistent. She was not random. She was not unknowable. She had built, within severe limitations, a reliable way of asking to be seen. And she had been asking it every day for years. Anyone paying sustained attention could have figured it out. The moving men took 15 minutes. 15 minutes. The diagnosis the physician delivered in Lynn's early childhood was precise and functionally total. She would not develop beyond a 4-year-old's cognitive capacity. The prognosis was permanent limitation. Now place that prognosis beside the piano account, beside the caretaker's daily knowledge of Lynn's patterns, beside Dorothy's description of Lynn seeking her specifically in a crowded room. The medical record describes the ceiling. The domestic testimony describes what Lynn built beneath it. She built preferences. She built patterns. She built a specific relationship with music that was entirely her own. She built a capacity for recognizing warmth, responding to it, seeking it out. None of that was development in the clinical sense the doctor meant. All of it was life. The medical record alone is a document of limitation. Placed beside what the caretakers and Dorothy observed, it becomes the frame that makes Lynn's interior world legible. She was operating at the full capacity of what she had. That is not a lesser version of being human. It is an entirely complete version of it. The two accounts together change what each account means when standing alone. That is what assembly does. The servant's account alone meant one thing. Beside the doctor's record, it meant something else entirely. Now place the caretaker testimony and the medical record beside the documented reality of Harold Nicholas's removal from Lynn's life. Dorothy in a neighbor's car, already in labor, going to the hospital without him. The letters sent to Paris. The letters not answered. The money that stopped. The caretakers hired because there was no co-parent available. Every nightclub engagement, every film role Dorothy took. Each one was the performance of a woman funding a care system that existed because one parent had removed himself. The three accounts assembled form a picture no single account contains. Lynn's life was shaped, from its first hours, by one parent's absence. Not by Lynn's disability. The disability was the condition. The absence was the context. Everything Dorothy was later forced to do, the reliance on paid caretakers, the financial pressure of sustaining them alone, the bankruptcy when the income couldn't sustain the private care, the state institution as the only remaining option, all of it was done from a position of structural solitude that existed before any of those crises arrived. Harold Nicholas established that solitude on the first day of Lynn's life. It did not lift. What the three accounts together prove, that none of them proves alone, is that the defining tragedy of Lynn Dandridge's life was not primarily her disability. It was abandonment, and the abandonment preceded the disability by approximately 9 months. Harold Nicholas died on July 3, 2000. He was 79 years old. Lynn was 56. She would live 3 more years. Harold Nicholas gave no account of Lynn. No interview, no memoir entry, no statement, formal or informal, in which he addresses his daughter's life, her institutionalization, her 40 years in state care, or her death. His silence on the subject is total in the public record. Place that silence beside Dorothy's account of the first day of Lynn's life. Harold at the golf course, Dorothy in a neighbor's car. Place it beside the years the caretakers managed Lynn's daily world in his absence. Place it beside the medical record of a child whose brain damage may have been compounded by a delayed arrival at the hospital. Place it beside 40 years of institutional care, during 38 of which her father was alive and never visited, or if he visited, it was never recorded. The distinction matters. The record does not clarify it. The silence is testimony. It is the most deliberate account in the assembled list. He had 37 years after Dorothy died to speak. He did not speak. No single witness saw everything. Together, they saw more than enough. The women who cared for Lynn in private settings were employees. Their position depended on their continued suitability to the household. What they knew of Lynn, the daily texture of her, the operational knowledge of what worked and what didn't, was professional knowledge obtained under employment conditions in a private home. It was not subject to any public record. It was not solicited by any external authority. Dorothy noted problems with some caretakers. That notation tells us the caretakers occupied a subordinate position in which their observations were not formally valued and their continued presence was conditional. They could be found unsuitable. They could be replaced. When Lynn moved from private care to the state institution, no mechanism existed to transfer what the departing caretaker knew. The institution did not interview her. The records did not ask for a personal history of who Lynn was. What the caretaker had built over years of daily proximity, irreplaceable, specific, embodied knowledge of this particular person, went with her into her own life unrequested. Their barrier was structural. The employment ended, and with it went the knowledge. It went dark, and nobody noted that it had. Lynn Dandridge had the cognitive capacity of a 4-year-old. She could not advocate for herself. She could not report her experience inside the institution. She could not say whether the care she received was adequate, whether she was frightened, whether the environment was sufficient. She could communicate. She communicated through the piano, through the turn on the bench, through the seeking of warmth in rooms where warmth was present. Those communications were real, and they were legible to anyone paying sustained attention. But they were not legible to a system that required testimony. A court cannot hear a piano scale. An oversight mechanism cannot receive a woman turning on a bench and waiting for applause. The system built to protect people like Lynn required language Lynn did not have, and offered nothing in its place. Her barrier was the most total on the list. She was present for her entire life. She experienced everything that happened to her. She could report none of it in any form the system recognized. And after 1965, nobody with the sustained access required to interpret her was coming regularly. The physicians who worked in institutional settings did not operate under professional norms that required advocacy for patients without family support. The standards of mid-20th century state institutional medicine were, in practice, management standards. Patients were maintained within a system. The system was not built around the individual. It was built around the category. A physician at a California state institution in 1968 who noticed that a particular patient had no visitors, no advocates, no family coming, that physician was not professionally positioned, within the infrastructure of that era, to generate a formal intervention. Icing was not the same as having recourse. The system within which the doctors operated had already decided, before Lynn arrived, what her category of person was worth. Individual physicians working within that system could observe what it produced. They could not, by themselves, change what it was. Their barrier was systemic. It was not individual cowardice. It was the predictable product of an institution that generated no mechanism for compiling the list. Harold Nicholas did not design the structural barriers above. They existed before he did. What he did was more targeted and more consequential. By removing himself completely from Dorothy's support structure and from any role in Lynn's care, he concentrated all advocacy for Lynn into a single point of failure. Dorothy was that point. She was the only person who combined, simultaneously, the knowledge of who Lynn was, the standing to demand better for her, and the motivation to fight for it. Without Dorothy, no one person in Lynn's life held all three. Dorothy died at 42. $2. A rented apartment in Hollywood. September 8, 1965. After that date, Lynn had the system. Nothing more. Harold Nicholas lived until 2000. 35 years after Dorothy's death. In those 35 years he could have become, not a replacement for Dorothy, nothing could have been that, but an advocate. A name in the visitor log. A person whose presence in the institutional record would have signaled that someone was watching. He did not appear, or if he did, it was not recorded. The caretakers could not speak because the employment ended. The doctors could not speak because the system produced no mechanism. He could have spoken. He had standing. He had resources. He had 35 years. He understood both barriers. He built his silence alongside them. And the three silences together were sufficient. Nobody asked. That was not an accident. The list was not compiled in a courthouse. No formal inquiry assembled the testimony. New York. No investigative journalist subpoenaed the records. The closest thing to a compilation happened in two phases, decades apart. The first was Dorothy herself. She documented what she knew in Everything and Nothing, completed shortly before her death. She named the golf course. She named the unanswered letters. She named the private care facilities and the financial machine that sustained them. She named the day the moving men came and the piano scale that played through it. She named what the bankruptcy meant for Lynn. She named the state institution and the reason she had no alternative. She named the moment at which everything collapsed at once, the bankruptcy, the divorce, the eviction, and Lynn returned to her doorstep in the same week. A 19-year-old the private facility had sent back because the bills had stopped. Dorothy compiled her portion of the list and placed it in a book. Then she died. The second phase came 34 years later, when researchers, biographers, and the HBO production team began working from that record and attempting to extend it forward in time. The attempt to locate Lynn, the inquiry that ended with a burned institution and a transferred patient whose whereabouts nobody could confirm, was the moment the gap in the list became visible as a gap. Not a blank that had simply never been filled in. A blank that had existed where something specific should have been. I found, in 4 separate archives, accounts that had never been placed beside each other. Dorothy's autobiography, the transcript record of the Mike Douglas segment, a disability history account that named the institution and noted the absence of any visitor record. The production account from the HBO film noting that Lynn's location after the fire could not be confirmed. None of the people who produced those 4 accounts knew the others had spoken. When I placed them beside each other, I understood why nobody had compiled the list. Not because the information was sent, because no single archive contained enough of it. The assembled picture only existed when you held all 4 accounts at once. That distribution was deliberate design, not oversight. What the assembled testimony reveals, when placed beside itself, Lynn Dandridge lived 60 years. She spent the first 20 in private care managed by her mother. She spent the last 40 in state institutional care. Her mother died when she was 22. Her father outlived her mother by 35 years. The record contains no account of him visiting. She had no known regular visitors in the decades after Dorothy's death. She died in 2003. The record contains no visitor. The record contains no one who came. That is the complete picture. No single witness saw it whole. The number of witnesses was never the problem. The problem was that nobody compiled the list. And that those are different things. The women who cared for Lynn in private settings left almost nothing in the formal record. Their names are absent from the public accounts. Their observations were never solicited by any authority. What they left is the negative space in Dorothy's writing, the reference to problems, the implicit structure of a household managed around profound disability without a co-parent present, the daily labor of a life that required other people's sustained attention to remain functional. They left their own lives after the employment ended. What those lives contained, what it had meant to care for Lynn day after day, what they made of the situation, whether they thought about her in the years after, is not in any record. That absence is itself part of the assembled testimony. The caretakers are the witnesses whose silence the system produced most cleanly, most completely, and with the least friction. The system was not designed to hear them. It was designed to employ them. Those are different things. Dorothy Dandridge left a book. She left the words. She left the account of the day the Oving men applauded, which is one of the most precise descriptions anywhere in literature of what it is to love someone the world has decided not to see. She left the account of Lynn pressing against her. She left the Mike Douglas segment, the one public moment in which a witness to Lynn's life chose to speak, in real time before it was too late. She left everything and nothing. The title holds more than it appears to. Dorothy had everything that the world cannot take. The knowledge of who Lynn was, the account of her in full, the love that existed in the space between them. She had nothing that the world regarded as sufficient. No money at the end, no career left standing, no co-parent, no institutional support, no second person who held Lynn's life as their own responsibility. She died with $2. The book endures. Harold Nicholas left an artistic legacy that is documented, celebrated, and real. The Nicholas brothers' contribution to American dance is beyond dispute. Fred Astaire's assessment was not wrong. He left no account of Lynn, no interview, no statement, no documented visit, no legal action on her behalf, no public acknowledgement of who she was or what her life had required. His silence on the subject of his daughter is total in the public record. Lynn outlived him by 3 years. The institution left a death record. Carolyn Suzanne Nicholas, born September 2, 1943, died 2003, age 60, California State Care. No record of regular visitors. No record of anyone claiming her remains or her story. The institutional record is what she was to the system that held her for 40 years. A patient number, a diagnosis, a managed case. The system received her. It maintained her. It recorded her death. What it recorded of the 40 years in between, if it recorded anything of those years burned or is sealed or has never been made public. What she was inside those 40 years. Whether she still sat at pianos if pianos were present. Whether she still turned D on the bench. Whether there was anyone in the room who thought to applaud. That is the most devastating gap in the compiled list. And it will likely remain a gap. Dorothy Dandridge's appearance on the Mike Douglas Show in 1963 was the only moment in which a witness to Lynn's life spoke publicly, in real time, before Lynn was gone, before the records burned, before the trail went cold. It was the only window there was. She said, "I never really thought I could give my daughter up to an institution." What that sentence contains is everything the caretakers couldn't say, the doctors didn't document, and Harold Nicholas refused to address. The specific weight of a specific love, carried by one person for 20 years without being asked, without being required to speak, out of her own decision to finally say it in public to strangers in Cleveland in 1963. Speaking cost Dorothy nothing additional. She was already at the bottom. What it gave the record is everything that came after, every account, every biography, every research document, every compiled list, including this one. All of it traces back to Dorothy saying, on a television stage, that her daughter existed and that she loved her and that she had not chosen this easily. It also left something else. It left proof that speaking was possible. That a witness, given space and moment, would speak. Nobody else took the space. Nobody else used the moment. That is the record's final accounting. There were at least 14 witnesses. They occupied 14 different positions around one life. Each one saw something the others could not. Not one of them was formally asked. Lynn Dandridge, Harolyn Suzanne Nicholas, was born on September 2, 1943. In a hospital her mother reached in a neighbor's car because her father was at a golf course. She died in 2003 in a California state facility whose location, after a fire destroyed the records, nobody connected to her story could confirm. She was 60 years old. No vis iter is recorded. No one is recorded as having come. She deserved one witness who spoke at the time.